Timothy Lane, thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much, Darcy.
The fact you're sitting in my living room is a bit crazy for me, having heard you throughout my childhood. So I really do appreciate your time today.
My pleasure, and no big deal.
I've got an interesting question to start it with. And it's, you go back to the things that I've heard and done in my homework of you. And it sounds to me as if, and whether you have the same view, that you were sort of destined to do what you're doing. So I believe, or my question is, do you think it's important to actively seek destiny? No. If destiny exists, do you think it's important to seek it actively or to let it reveal itself naturally?
Well, in my case, I wasn't seeking it actively because I just didn't know that there was a possible destiny like the one that I stumbled into. So no, I think it can happen in a number of ways, and life's complex, and there aren't predictable paths. Otherwise, everybody would get to exactly where they wanted to go, and all the fun and frustration would disappear from the game of life. And it's more serious than a game in lots of ways. But no, I was at uni studying science, no idea why I was doing it, and as a result I had no real motivation. And I'd done it successfully at school, but at uni it gets hard. I'd had to leave home to go to Hobart from northern Tasmania, and I wasn't ready for that. I lived in a residential college at the University of Tasmania, and there were too many distractions and too many excuses not to commit to work. I hated it. I had 3 years, and I knew I was failing almost from day one, and I had no will to actually change things. So in the end, I fell flat on my face in my third year. My father had died suddenly that year. That didn't cause me to fail. I was failing well and truly. Before that happened, it did mean though that when the year ended and I failed everything that year, which was a bit shattering and embarrassing.
Did you expect it?
Pretty much. I didn't quite realise how bad it would be.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I heard you say that you weren't mature enough.
Yep.
But you weren't used to having things done for you. No, you were so used to having things done for you, you didn't know how to fend for yourself. Well,
Yes, but in the way I suppose most kids growing up do, if they're at all fortunate. I mean, the family life I lived in was far from perfect, but nevertheless, Mum was a very committed mother, and so she did her best. It was a bit chaotic at times, but I hadn't been a hard worker academically while I was at school. So in many ways, I was preparing to fail even then. And anyway, that's the way it all played out. And I went back home, tail between my legs. And early on in the next year, and I was now working as a labourer in a vegetable cannery, an Edgell vegetable cannery. And in March, I happened into a conversation with a bloke who was the local football commentator on a small country radio station in Devonport.
Elton Alexander,
and out of that, I found a career. I had no idea that would be the case, but within a week or two, once I realised I actually could kind of talk live to air in an ad-lib situation, although it was calling football, so it's not entirely ad-libbed. You're not just creating ideas out of your own head. You're seeing something and you're translating actions into words. Once, after 2 or 3 weeks, I realised I could do it. I thought, maybe this is for me, and so it was.
Did that childhood that you described, how important do you think that's played into where you are now?
Well, my father loved sport, and he was taking my elder brother, and then there was a younger brother, and the youngest of four was my sister. Dad was taking big brother Chris and me to the footy. Probably, I've often tried to pin down what year it might have been. I reckon I was 4 or 5 when I first went to a game.
So mid-50s.
And like lots of kids, I was sort of hypnotised by it. There were crowds, of about 1,000 people on average at the games I'd be going to. But that seemed like a lot of people. I mean, that was more than gathered at school each day, and more than were at Catholic Mass on Sunday mornings, which was, one of the bigger congregations that I was ever a part of at that stage of my life. So it seemed important, and the crowds got involved, and, there was yelling and abuse and cheers and, all of that. And so, as happens with, that's the magic of footy and the various codes around the world and other sports as well. But I think the football codes are probably the ones that achieve the effect to the maximum. And so it was for me. And I do remember going to Mass one Sunday, probably at the start of my second season as a footy follower, and I smuggled inside my prayer book the footy record from the day before and would sit there, and I was young enough to be forgiven for that, sort of sat there reading that while the sermon was being delivered and that sort of thing, because footy was my religion even at that young stage.
Were you naturally curious at that age, do you think?
Well, I was curious about footy. I was curious, interestingly, about numbers. And I don't know whether footy helped me with arithmetic or it was the other way round.
8 times 6.
I can remember looking at the scores on the back page and really kind of enjoying looking at scores of matches from the previous season and sort of remembering some of those games, but seeing the numbers, 20-20, 140 to 12-10, 82 sort of thing. And I've always loved the numbers involved in the football scoring system. I think it's an underrated and really attractive aspect of the game.
I remember you saying it was hard for someone that grew up in northwest of Tasmania to ever think or imagine a world in which you'd make it to the point where you'd be doing commentary. Well,
it's a good point. I mean, first of all, to get into country radio in Devonport seemed like something a bit far-fetched. But the idea of, at some stage, finding my way to Melbourne, and I began thinking about it from fairly early on, that is what I would like to do if this did turn into a career and played out according to my wishes. And, Melbourne for young Tasmanians at that stage seemed a long way away, and the idea of mixing it in the big smoke was a huge deal. And, it wasn't until I got here and survived for a while that I realised that it could be done, because early on I did feel pretty timid about it. And shudder to hear back any of my earliest broadcasts in Tassie, as I would hearing back some of my early ones in Melbourne.
What made you realise you could do it?
I think in Tassie I just began to find ways of calling the footy that I felt worked. Until I joined the ABC, which was in my second year, I didn't ever have the technical backing to be able to record myself and have a listen back to it. But I began doing that when I got my job with the ABC in Launceston in 1973, and hearing back my footy broadcasting, I thought, I reckon I can do this. When you're doing it in a small population centre and the crowds are pretty thin, you don't have the maximum orchestral backing of a big MCG-style crowd. And that's probably helpful in a way. You actually have to learn to make the sound of your commentary work a cappella. There's no orchestra. And I found my way towards doing that. I didn't like all the stuff that I did at that time. But look, because into that first year with the ABC, I was now doing work in studio. At the end of the footy, I'd go back to the studio and present a sporting roundup with all the day's footy results and the horse racing results and so on. In the studio, I was almost paralysed by fear, by nervousness, but at the footy, there was an energy within me which enabled me to express what I was doing in a way that worked. And I suppose I began to realise that, and I used to wonder why I can call the game pretty well, and yet my voice when I was in the studio sounded just flat as a pancake. And that, I suppose it is about being stimulated by what you're doing. And different people are stimulated by different things. Some are thrilled and stimulated at being in the studio or on the stage or in front of a TV camera. I was at optimal stimulation when I was calling the game.
My first match between Devonport and East Devonport in 1972 on 7AD Devonport. I'm sure I was extremely nervous and self-conscious, and nostalgia notwithstanding, I'm glad there's no recording of it.
Yes. In May the 6th, 1972 it was. I almost didn't make it because the meeting with Elton Alexander in a pub on the Monday of the March long weekend prompted him to say, why don't you come along and try it? And I said, well, yeah, okay, if you can talk the station manager into having on the air a young bloke you met and he was half full of ink in the pub, and he said, that'll be all right, that'll take care of itself. So I now had this opportunity, and I woke up the next morning with a bit of a hangover and remember lying in bed thinking, did that really happen? And I knew it did. But then I thought, was he fair dinkum, or had he had enough to drink to maybe wake up wondering about a bad call he made the previous day? And I didn't want to embarrass him, so I knew where he worked. He'd let me know where he worked and said, give me a ring. And I didn't ring because I thought my memory's pretty clear that it wasn't cold feet. It was more that I didn't want to put him on the spot. And so I didn't follow up. And the season started and I wasn't there. And about 4 weeks in, on a Saturday night, with my elder brother, I went to a different pub in Devonport, and who should walk in the door but Elton. And he immediately came over to me and he said, what happened? And I said, I just didn't know whether you'd think it was a good idea when you reflected on it. He was insistent, and he said, if you want to do it, turn up next week or forget it. Okay. So I was there the next week, May the 6th, and my sort of the lump in the throat from nerves was so constricting I could barely get the words out at the start. But after a little while, I began to relax and get the feel of it. That
self-doubt piece is interesting.
Well, yeah, I don't know whether I'm a natural performer in a general sense. I don't have that extroverted way that almost makes it easy for some people. And I reckon there are probably plenty of people in areas of expression, sports broadcasting, but lots of other things who are a bit the same. But they do want to step out onto the stage and express themselves in some way. And I did have that yearning, and I've in many ways had to battle against the self-belief issue, all the way along the line. But certainly as far as broadcasting events, football and cricket and other things that I've done, I came to develop enough self-belief, I guess, to steadily improve and believe in myself.
How do you think that was developed?
Probably by time at the wheel,
yeah.
and listening back to my work. I always found that a really useful tool. There was a key moment in Hobart after I'd had about 4 years there, and I was getting impatient to get a job in Melbourne. And the ABC had a guy who had been a bit of a doyen broadcaster. He used to do a late-night jazz music program called Relax With Me, and his name was Arch McCurdy. And Arch was now working as like the talent scout mentor for younger broadcasters around the country. He was based in Sydney, travelled to the various states to talk with young people one-on-one. He came at one stage, and I wasn't included on the list of people that he was going to talk to, but the next time he came to Hobart, maybe the next year, I was. And I was really excited to meet Arch McCurdy, who was a bit famous. But I also thought, this is an opportunity to try and convince someone that I've got it and that they ought to pick me up on the other side of Bass Strait. And I was given instructions to take along samples of my work, and I had some edited football highlights. And there was one little grab in it which had come from a finals match the previous year, which I knew was good. It was just a moment of inspiration in how I described something. And I was really hoping that might get his attention. He had this tape on, he hit the play button on the old reel-to-reel deck. And there were a few highlights, and he's just sitting there, eyes a bit glazed. And then up came this highlight, this moment. And when it ran through, he leant forward, he hit the stop button, and then he hit the rewind button, and the tape wound back, and he hit the stop button, and then he hit play, and he played it again. And I'm sort of sitting there almost frozen. And when he heard it the second time, he said, "That's fantastic." He didn't say a whole lot more. We, finished our session. That was probably 1978, and late that year or early in 79, I found out that I had a job in Melbourne. A job had come up, and Dick Mason, the boss over here, got in touch and said he wanted me to fill the vacancy. And I'd been in Melbourne for about a year, I suppose, and one day we were down in the TV studios at Ripon Lee, but this particular day I was up in the city outside Broadcast House. And I saw this bloke coming out the door, and I realised it was Arch McCurdy, and who I'd not seen since that fateful day in Hobart. And I couldn't resist intercepting him and saying, "I'm Tim Lane, I met you in Hobart a couple of years ago, and I'm over here now." And he said, "I know." So I think he probably played a part in what happened for me. And I used to listen to Relax With Me, and I know a lot of the students in the college I lived in when I was at uni used to listen.
What was that moment like?
Oh, it was lovely. It was very heartwarming, and just the sense of who would have thought that Arch McCurdy might become a person who got me to where I wanted to go.
Has that "who would have thought" question played a part in your career to date, do you think? Who would have thought? Like, who would have thought I'd be doing this?
Oh, well, I mean, it's been so long lasting now.
Yeah, for sure.
It's more than 50 years.
Of course.
Who would have thought I'd work at anything for 50 years? But, I've had moments where big things have come my way, and calling Kathy Freeman at the Olympic Games, that sort of thing. And that does cause a who would have thought kind of thing. She probably feels the same way, Kathy.
She does.
Yeah. Well, I'd imagine she might, because life's like that. I think when things happen that are just mind-blowing in terms of fulfilling your dreams, your ambitions, there is that sense, I think, who would have thought.
I don't want to talk about that at a later stage, but first, take me back to the 4th of August, 1979.
Well, that was the day I'd moved to Melbourne by then. And
With a newborn?
What's that?
With a newborn?
Well, with a newborn, yep. And actually, Sam and Jane, her mum, weren't here yet. I was in Melbourne looking for accommodation, and was sort of, being put up by the ABC at that stage. I had to go back to Hobart for a Friday night event. We were doing a basketball series that I'd been involved with from start to that point in time, which was a couple of years. We'd run 2 seasons of this thing. And it was the grand final, and that was going to be my last involvement with it. And I did want to be back in Hobart to do that, and was given approval to do that. And then I had to fly to Melbourne for Saturday footy to call my first game between Fitzroy and Hawthorn at Princes Park, when Hawthorn used to play their home games there. And I have a recollection of the plane actually flying over. Its flight path took us pretty much over Princes Park, and it must have been about 10 on Saturday morning or something. And here I am looking down on the ground thinking I'm going to be down there calling a game a little bit later today. And so it was. And that was a very exciting and fulfilling sort of moment to have arrived here and to be actually calling a game of footy.
Was it even more fulfilling calling your first grand final that year?
Oh, well, there's a who would have thought moment. It was only 7 years earlier I'd come over from Tassie to see the first game of Victorian football that I'd ever seen, and that was for the grand final in 72 between Carlton and Richmond. Mad Carlton supporter. They were rank underdogs. You just couldn't really give them a hope of winning the game, and who would have thought they'd kick a record score which would still stand today, and no one's got within a bull's roar of it yet. And then in 79, I'm in Melbourne now working, and a few weeks after arriving, I'm calling the grand final. I shouldn't have been, actually, because we had a team of commentators for the TV coverage. We'd do 3 games each weekend with 6 commentators, 2 on each game. 3 of us were staff and 3 were ex-player expert commentators, and that was the right mix. For the grand final, what had normally happened was that, or for finals, there'd be 2 staff and 1 expert on each game. But we had a minor industrial skirmish in the lead up to this, which, I didn't want to have a bar of because I'd just arrived. But Dick Mason had suggested that we use 3 staff for the grand final and 3 contractors, the experts, for the preliminary, so that everybody at least got a taste on the last 2 weeks of the season, the 2 biggest weeks. And the staff jacked up and said we should be represented in the commentary team for both games. Dick sort of threw the toys out of the cot, and he said, "Okay, you can do the lot," and went off in a bit of a huff. And that meant that suddenly I was broadcasting the grand final. I almost would rather not have been, because Carlton were playing, and they'd been top of the ladder all year, and so they're hot favourites against Collingwood, and it was a thriller. And, it was pretty difficult, actually. I'd often wondered what it would be like arriving in Melbourne and actually calling Carlton games, because I was a mad supporter at that time, which is not ideal. And it's something I rethought as the years went by, but it took quite a while to work that out of my system. Which was bigger, the 4th of August or the grand final? I guess the grand final because of the crowd, but they were both, unforgettable days.
You said you didn't think you'd be calling more than 1 final after that.
Didn't think I'd be calling more than one.
More than one. What I've written here is, I didn't imagine I'd be calling more than 1 final. I don't know if you.
Maybe that was that year.
Yeah.
I was thinking I would only be doing the first week.
Okay.
When there were
there you go.
a couple of games on, and that I would sort of then be in the seconds or on the bench for the next 3 weeks. But so that's another way of, in shorthand, of telling the story that I told in longhand a moment ago. When
did you feel, for lack of a better word, at home? Like you felt like, I'm really a part of this?
It can happen pretty quickly. I think when you're young, it's. I reckon most of the young Turks I've known have had a lot of self-belief at an early stage, and sometimes more than is warranted. And I probably developed a bit of that in fairly quick time. And then I actually found myself broadcasting the athletics at the Brisbane Commonwealth Games in '82. So I now felt as though I was considered to be among the frontline broadcasters within the ABC system at that time, sports broadcasters. Things like that were encouraging my self-belief. And I suppose the trick then is not to be too carried away with the progress you're making. And we probably all have moments where we are. But I think, through most of it, I managed to keep my feet reasonably well planted on the ground, but I wouldn't say always.
Were you obsessed, do you think?
I was, yeah. I mean, it's a very seductive kind of thing. Your sport has that effect on so many young people and young adults, and I was still a young adult. And so I was obsessed with the sport, as I had been since childhood. And then there comes the broadcasting and the fact that you're actually now, being seen and heard as someone who is delivering the product and the gospel. And so that becomes an obsession. And in fact, I have said over the years that I feel as though it's not very long once you're really involved in major sporting events that the broadcast kind of supersedes the game itself in terms of your priorities.
Why is that?
Why is it? Well, it's just that's about you. The football is about, it had been about me barracking fiercely for a footy team or Australia when the cricket was being played or whatever. But now it was, me talking about it, which became a bigger thing. It's a separate thing in a sense. And that does become the passion and the obsession. And try to develop what you're doing, do it well. And then there are days where you come away from it feeling as though you have done it well and you feel great. And then there are days where you feel as though you've goofed up in some way and you can beat up on yourself for a little while.
You think
Plenty of those?
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think it was a healthy obsession?
Oh, generally, I think. I mean, it's. I think the good fortune in having an opportunity present itself that was life-changing, provided a career, provided security through my life, is something that was greater than the pitfalls that it might have provided, which occasionally was a factor and a less fortunate factor. But no, I'd take it every day.
How did you deal with the mistakes you made?
Oh, well, early on, there were moments where I just, if I just got a major fact wrong or whatever, or stuffed up in my performance on the air, and there were moments like that, it's all live broadcasting and you're thinking on your feet and sometimes your head's not clear or whatever. And I would punish myself for a few days, and then I suppose I began to realise, the world didn't end, and I didn't ever want to become blasé about mistakes, but I began to realise that, the world would go on, my career would go on, and so it wasn't worth getting too uptight about.
What did that punishment look like? Was it a more self-reflection, or was it you weren't obviously doing anything out of the ordinary, but it was more just in your head, more so?
Yeah, just feeling stupid.
Okay.
How am I ever going to put my head up with my colleagues again after stuffing that up, sort of thing. But everyone's made mistakes, and they have too, and so, you know.
Does that just make you want to get better?
I guess I want to be more bulletproof, I guess. Just to find ways of avoiding those traps or whatever they might be, or when they came, when difficult moments came, just finding ways through them. I think doing radio from the end of the 1980s until about the end of 2002 with the ABC, and doing lots of football and cricket was a really rewarding time for me, in that radio, I think, is easier than TV, certainly for me. And I began to find it was like a second radio career. I'd done radio in Tassie, then I'd moved to Melbourne and done TV. And now I was back in radio land, and all of a sudden I felt clearer in the head when I was broadcasting, and I felt as though I had a bit of time to think, certainly on my good days, on my feet. On bad days, that's not quite so easy for whatever reason. You're just not, in the right place for some reason. You haven't got full clarity. But I think those radio years began to equip me with ways of just working through awkward moments. And there were plenty of those, because we did a lot of live interviews, and I think during that time we developed a format which encouraged a more confrontational interview style at times, and that can be unpredictable. You don't know what's going to come back at you with that sort of thing, and learning to do that, you just, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger sort of thing. And so just, it's a bit like being an athlete and doing resistance training of some sort, and you can't feel while you're doing it that it is making you better at what you do, but the effects come a little bit later on.
It's interesting to think about, because I find it hard to listen back and listen to my voice. And, you make mistakes, but does anyone else even pick up on it? Because I have people tell me I'm doing good all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I can't even fathom a world in which that's good.
Mm.
Do you have that as well?
You're taking me way back in my career now, because when I arrived in Launceston to work for the ABC, the boss in Hobart had sent up one of the young broadcasters from Hobart, but he'd already had about 4 years' experience, so he was 4 years more advanced than I was. And the first thing he did was, after we'd sort of met and greeted and shook, had a cup of coffee or whatever, he took me into a studio with some news scripts, and he read, a couple of news stories, and then he got me to read a couple, and then we went next door to where they'd been recorded and had to listen to them. And when I heard myself, I just thought, I've got no hope, and my voice seemed so flat, and I almost couldn't see a way forward. He sounded like a trained broadcaster, and I sounded like someone who just walked in off the street, which is largely what had happened. And I think I was traumatised by that moment. I mean, for years, I felt I sounded all right when I broadcast a game, and again, it gets back to that energy. But broadcasting in a studio or just talking live to air, I felt my voice lacked energy and was flat. I suppose in the end, you've just got to, and I wondered about that for years. And I have people these days complimenting me on my voice and saying it's well suited to what you've been doing for all these years. Well, it didn't always feel like that to me. But it's trust, I think, and it's trusting yourself. If I think anyone can sound adequate and more on the air if they are talking about something that does energise them, that interests them, whether it's calling a football match or discussing, butterflies or bees or, insect life or whatever. When you hear people who are really moved by these things, talking on ABC Radio National, you know, they sound terrific because they're fully engaged and they know lots about an obscure subject, and that shines through.
It's interesting to think about, you said before the bad days as well. Like, it's probably hard for some people to look at a broadcaster or someone on TV and think they're just a person as well. They have bad days.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you show up when that happens?
Well, that's, you know, where you look for a hole big enough to bury yourself in, but it is the way of it. And, you know, some of the great actors talk about having suffered stage fright and saying that just about everyone has, you know, even the greatest in the field who seem so confident and in command. When they do it live on stage, you know, they actually develop mechanisms, as I understand it, with experience to get themselves out of a hole. But it's comforting to know that there are great actors who have forgotten their lines or just frozen for a moment, as rather than being focused on that task that they've become very good at performing, for a moment they become distracted by the fear that's involved in presenting in front of a massive audience. And that's a hard thing to cope with, I think, for most people early on.
Sure.
You know, they say public speaking for the average person is one of the most terrifying experiences that they would ever contemplate. And I was definitely in that category. So you can find comfort in the fact that, you know, even the best have struggled with that in moments.
How did being a father change your life?
It's changed it in phases, which I think is probably true for, you know, most fathers, at a guess. I don't know, I'm not the full authority. I remember talking to Graham Corns, the former champion South Australian footballer and coached the Crows when they came into the AFL.
That's Kane's father, is
Kane
it?
and Chad's father, by, I think, his first wife.
Yep.
And some years later, he'd remarried and he'd become a father again, I think probably at about 50. And I remember talking to him on the phone one day. I was sort of ringing him from Melbourne to see whether we could set up an interview with him. And we got talking about other stuff. And I said, how's parenthood this time round? And I remember his words. He said to me, fatherhood is wasted on the young. And this was probably 16, 17, 18 years after Sam had been born. Wow. But I realised the relevance and wisdom of what he was saying.
What is that?
Young men are doing other things and career type things, you know, some less healthy things. And so I reckon, you know, for a lot of young men, it's life-changing and it's beautiful and it's brilliant and all of that. But I think I was a better father in a sense second time round. I only have one child. But my marriage broke up when Sam was 4. And then 6 years after that, her mum died suddenly, and so I was now thrust into single parenthood. And while I wasn't perfect, I think I was a better parent second time round than I was first.
I had a chat to her before this. She said the best memories that she had were you singing in the living room. Can you talk to me about what that was like raising her, like, because she described it as though you only had her for 2 days, and then her mum had her on the rest.
Yeah.
So that would have been a life changer for you, I suspect.
It was, yeah. I mean, not easy being a parent who now becomes, very part-time when a marriage breaks up. And I found that hard, but gradually made the adjustment. And it did mean that and it was tragic when Sam's mum died, and I was shocked and deeply saddened, but I also, underlying that, had this feeling of now, being able to take full responsibility and commit in a full way to being a parent. Now, it wasn't easy because I had this job and I wondered whether I'd keep on doing it, but I didn't really have too many options in my life. And so I kept broadcasting. And Sam probably has some mixed feelings about that, but I'm sure she doesn't resent it. And there were things about it that she really enjoyed. She kind of developed an interest in football because she thought it was something, she had none at that stage, but she thought it was something that could actually bring us together. So we started watching Friday night games, and she started committing herself to being a Carlton supporter, and so we had a lot of fun through those times. They won the flag in '95, and that was really exciting for her and for me.
A few months after I was born.
Right. Okay. So I mean, it's complicated putting all the pieces together, and I, there are things I suppose I asked myself questions about, but I needed to bring in an income, and I needed to be in a good place, psychologically, and certainly my working life helped with both of those things. So I pursued it, and at times it wasn't easy for Sam because I was constantly having to make arrangements for her to be with other people on weekends or when I travelled doing cricket during the summer. And so we were sort of getting there, but in a difficult way, and particularly for Sam, who I think at times suffered in silence through that period.
You comfortable? You asked about the questions before, like questioning. Are you comfortable talking about what those actual questions were?
That I asked. Well, I suppose. I wasn't so self-questioning through those times, other than in terms of my management of things.
Okay.
I felt justified in doing the job that I did because it was the best way of me, being in a good place. But I was hopeless at managing the situation I now found myself in as a single parent. And at times I had to lean very heavily on people, not every so often, but pretty regularly, because my working life involved asking people for help every weekend for 6 months of the year, and then for weeks at a time or a week at a time, a few times over the summer months. So I've questioned that, but it's done. We survived, and it wasn't all good, but it worked out pretty well. Was
it hard to show up during those times?
Hard to show up for work.
You talk about psychologically, like it would have been, I imagine it would have been hard to, because I've got stuff going on now, and it's hard to separate yourself fully from them. No matter how hard you try, you're just like, you want to be the best version of yourself, but it's hard. It's hard sometimes when there's other stuff going on. So that's why I say that. That's why I asked that, sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, based on what was there in front of me, and I haven't really had an extended conversation with Sam about this. We've had shorter ones once or twice. But I just think it needed to be the way it was, actually. I can live with that. And I think she can live with it too, and she does, and she's never been condemning of me. I think, at times she felt that I was that I could have given more to her. But I think a lot of people as they grow up would say the same of their parents. Life's not all straightforward, and we've got to make decisions about how we manage it, how we make ends meet. And that's where I was at.
Talk to me about Misty, Mittens and Fluffy.
Well, they were the three cats I inherited with Sam. And early on it was very difficult. One of them in particular, Misty, was Sam and her mum had taken Misty in as a stray that they found. She'd sort of walked in off the street, and she was hungry, and she remained ravenously hungry for years, really. And there were times early on when I'd open the fridge to get the cat food out, and she'd jump in and try and eat whatever was there. So it was testing of my patience. And I do have and this is, part of what we've been talking about, I guess, my ability to kind of handle the things that I can't control is not great, and never has been, and probably never will be. My fuse can be short. So dealing with those three cats early on was, and I say early on, probably the first 5 years was not great. And also, Misty would want to go out a couple of times a night, and we didn't have a cat door, and so she'd be at my bedroom door meowing and wanting to go out. So I'd have to get up and let her out, and then I'd go back, put my head on the pillow, and just as the lights would go out again, she'd be at the window wanting to come in. So I lost a bit of sleep over Misty, and but we adjusted.
That piece, what you said before, getting frustrated, is that because you hold yourself potentially, because I'm the same with my perfectionism with what I do, and if someone does the wrong thing or behaves in a certain way, I just can't imagine how they did that. I'm just like, how are you not seeing what you're doing? Is that what it was, do you think, or is it something else?
Look, I don't really know. I've never had myself psychoanalysed to try and understand better the way I am. It's something I do think about and still think about, and maybe we'll seek some help at some stage. But why are we like we are? It's hard to explain. I mean, I grew up in a certain degree of chaos and disarray, I guess, and so order for me was always important. And if it's not there, I can get frustrated, or if something that I wasn't predicting would happen happens, and it inconveniences me. I'm not the best at just taking a couple of deep breaths and moving on. But there you go.
Chaos growing up. What did that look like?
Oh, look, I won't go into too much detail, but Mum and Dad weren't, they probably witnessed their relationship fracturing. And I don't love either of them the less. They're both dead now, of course, but they struggled, and we all struggle to a certain extent. Some of their struggles, seen through the eyes of a kid, were difficult to digest, but that's the way it was. But they're my parents, and I don't want to put their stories
Of course.
out there on the record.
Sam wants to know why you made them clean the cats all the time.
Why
you made them bath. You have to give the cats baths.
Well, yeah. Well, they needed them, is the short answer. But there was one occasion when Sam and I were just becoming a little bit distant, and over a period, she was, now fully into adolescence, I guess, and I was the old parent. And one weekend during one of these periods of distance, we mutually agreed we'd bath the cats. And it was a hell of an ordeal, particularly with this Misty, who was crazy. And she would just be desperately trying to free herself of the grip that I had on the back of her neck, as I'm submerging her in water. And anyway, this day we got it done, and we did it as a team, and we felt really pleased about having done it, and it was helpful to us. And it's funny how things like that, work out like that. Sometimes doing something difficult is the way to go, and you don't realise it while you're doing it, but your picture becomes clearer later on.
I needed to hear that. Because I'm in the absolute thick of it, but I've got a vision, I've got a drive of where I want to be. But when you're in the thick of it, you're just like, how is that going to happen? It's so far away. I want to talk to you about some of your career highlights, and I just want a brief summary of the energy of what it was like to call those games. The first one you touched on before, the Carlton Grand Final win in 1995. Can you remember calling that?
Oh, I do, yeah. I don't kick by kick, but
yeah, of course. Yeah.
Carlton been in the grand final in 93, played Essendon. Carlton were probably slight favourites going into that game. Sam now had become hooked on the game, and she had a ticket, and I had an idea where it was in the ground. So before the game was underway, I was actually searching with my binoculars across to the southern side to see if I could locate her, and I did. And she was with my younger brother, Bill, who's a Carlton fan. The game got out of Carlton's control very early. Remember that Michael Long goal that Sauce claimed he'd touched, and all of that. I mean, Essendon were on a roll and Carlton were in strife, and when the Bombers got up by about 4 goals, I just sort of chanced a look across the ground, and I realised that Sam and Bill realised they were in trouble as well. At the end of the day, I was going to meet them outside the old Gallery of Sport on the northern side of the MCG. It doesn't exist in that form anymore, where it was external to the ground. And when I met them, I gave Sam a hug, and a couple of minutes later, Bill said to me, because this was an hour after the game had ended, he sort of whispered to me, it's the first time she's spoken since the final siren. So she wasn't happy about the outcome. And then they're there again in 95, so I was really hoping. They'd had this dominant season, only lost 2 games. Had won, 15 in a row going to the grand final. So I was really hoping, more for her sake than mine, but for my sake, because I wanted it for her sake. And
not yours at all.
I was pretty wound up and very excited, as the Blues did what Essendon had done 2 years earlier, only more so. And I remember 3/4 time I was ducking out the back door of the box to go to the loo. Joyce Brown, the famous netball coach and mother of Fraser Brown, who was in Carlton's team, had been doing some work for us that year, and she'd been in the box. And as I was going out, she was coming in, and I remember saying, "Joyce, we've got it." And Joyce, being Carlton were 10 goals in front, Joyce said to me, "It's not over, Tim." So that was the difference between us. But anyway, Carlton won it easily, and it was a good day.
Bulldogs 2016.
Yeah, well, that was it's really good to, as a football commentator, to call a great and emotional grand final where your team has nothing to do with it. And so with a game like that, and I think people all over Melbourne felt this, you know, everyone was a bulldog except South Melbourne supporters who were barracked for the Swans. And that was a really great day. It was a different grand final experience from any other that I've had, and I've called 40 now, I think it is, and been to a few others.
Amazing.
Yeah, and just that day with the Dogs there as the feel-good story in truckloads, and also the colours. You know, I've always felt colours are so important to football, and you go to, like, Carlton play Essendon in the grand final, the crowd's in dark colours. There's a lot of black and a lot of navy blue with splashes of red and white. On this day, it was all red and red, white and blue, and it was the most beautiful-looking, bright grand final crowd I've ever seen. And, I mean, I feel a bit for the Swans. They got 8 free kicks that day, so they're probably a bit stiff. Maybe the umpires were like the rest of Melbourne and wanting to see the Bulldogs win. But anyway, they were magnificent in that final series to do what they did. Had to go to Perth on the first week as underdogs, and they won that, sudden death. Every game was sudden death. Beat Hawthorn, ended their 3 premiership streak, and then had to go up and play GWS up there as serious outsiders, and then, you know, beat the Swans on grand final day. It was a magnificent campaign. I actually called 3 of the 4 games, and I was a committed Bulldog, I'd have to shamefully admit, because I try to be unbiased through the lot of it.
You spoke about energy before. I can't imagine the energy in the air, and I actually don't think I have been to a grand final that I can recall. Yeah. So I've been to prelims. You talk about getting energy from the crowd during something like the Western Bulldogs of Sydney. I imagine you're just in the commentary box just before you're about to go, and you are.
Yeah, well, a part of, I think, calling well on grand final day is just pulling yourself back early, so that you've got somewhere to go when things really start to get exciting. And I still, all these years on, struggle with that because it's just such a great occasion. You know, the MCG jam-packed with people and big build-up and all of that. It's climax of the season, and, you know, it's all or nothing for the 2 teams. So it's brilliant, and it takes you up, and you have to try and just pull yourself down a little bit, and that's you know, it is an important part of broadcasting it.
99 prelim.
Yeah, well, that was Carlton and Essendon, and the Blues were rank outsiders. Sam had gone off on her sort of rite of passage to Europe in the first half of that year. I was going over to cover the Cricket World Cup through the middle of the year, 6 weeks in Britain. And so we caught up a bit during all of that. And then when that was all over, and Australia had a very dramatic semi-final, which I was broadcasting for the BBC as well as for Australia in the climax to that. And it was that is right up there snapping at Kathy Freeman's heels in terms of how exciting and it was, and how proud it made me for broadcasting it pretty well. So that was a huge vibe. And then I actually had to drive from Edgbaston in Birmingham to London after it was all done that night and meet Sam, who was arriving in from Ireland. And so we had a terrific time just seeing each other every couple of weeks or so. And then it was goodbye because I was heading home. And coming up towards September, I remember sending her an email at one stage saying, you're not going to miss anything at finals time because Carlton have got no hope. Well, in the finals, they got beaten by 75 points, I think, on the first week of the finals by Brisbane. But because of the anomalies of the final system, they survived. They didn't get knocked out. Hadn't finished in the top four. But at that stage, with the terrible final eight system that had been introduced, they stayed in the race. They had to beat, I think, the Eagles the next week, and the Eagles should have been playing them in the West, but they had to come to Melbourne because of the contract that the AFL had with the MCG. Carlton won that, and then they had to play Essendon in a preliminary final, and the Bombers had been the form team through the second half of the year, and they had the wood in a big way on Carlton. But that day, I reckon the roles were reversed in that Essendon always beat Carlton when they weren't expected to, but this day they were expected to, and it went belly up for them. They were 4 goals down at half time, then they had a big third quarter and got to the lead, but I think someone sledged Craig Bradley, who was getting to his senior years as a player, and Stephen Silvani called the players together at three-quarter time and kind of told them what had happened and said, we've got to respond. And this kind of really got to them. And so in the last quarter, they really lifted and they won the game. And Sam was listening to it on shortwave radio. I mean, it wasn't on a computer. It was, on a dodgy international shortwave reception. And by the time I got home that night, there was a voice message on I didn't have a mobile phone at that stage, on the landline, with the answering machine. And she'd been listening to it in Sorrento in Italy, and she was very excited. So was I. It was my birthday as well. And it was also the day that Steve Bracks almost unbelievably knocked off Jeff Kennett, or he drew with him, and then they had a by-election. It went to extra time, and Steve Bracks won power.
You're a good storyteller. Very good storyteller. I love it.
Thank you.
Freeman gets to the front. Freeman leads by a metre, but Freeman is too good. The crowd roaring. Freeman wins gold. Kathy's the winner. Australia's the winner.
Sounds familiar.
Do you remember calling that?
Oh, I do. Yeah. That was it was probably the one event that I kind of made the mistake of, identifying and thinking about in advance.
Thinking about the start.
Well, I didn't think about the start. That was sort of a bit different. It was just that, back in about, May. I'm not sure whether a check of the facts would prove me right here, but whenever the schedule of events came out, so I knew the date and the time that the final would be held. And I remember when that occurred to me, I thought, at that moment the gun's going to go off, and 50 seconds, I don't know what's going to happen, but I reckon Kathy's going to win it. And it's like I'm laying down a document for history, because that will live in the archives of the ABC for as long as archives exist at the ABC, and will from time to time come out and be replayed. And so it just underlined for me how important it was to make a good fist of it. As it turned out, our producer, Alan Marks, had me with Peter Hadfield, former decathlete, who was our expert commentator, talking on air for about 20 minutes leading up to the race. Normally the crosses would be short and sharp, and no sooner had you been crossed to than the gun would go and you'd launch into your call of whatever event it was. But this clearly was different. And so we talked and were very relaxed. And by the time they're on their blocks, I'm in a relaxed vein and feeling on top of things. And as the gun exploded, I thought, what do I say? I mean, you haven't got time to think that, but that was kind of what crossed my mind in a fleeting moment. And what I was about to say was exactly what I had said, what was it, 18 years earlier when Raylene Boyle's famous 400-metre win at the Commonwealth Games in Brisbane started. And and you heard the gun, and I said, and a huge roar split the air at QE2, which was the stadium. And I remember my friend and colleague, the late Drew Morfitt, and Drew was very generous at giving a compliment where he felt it was in order. And I remember him saying to me, those first few words were just perfect. And so in this moment, I was about to repeat them for Kathy's race. And for whatever reason, I thought, I can't say that again. So I just kind of freewheeled into a different form of words, and away it went from there.
It was an event of about 50 seconds duration, and however it turned out, the call would exist as a historical document for the future. The night was also the best session of sport I've ever witnessed.
Yeah.
What was so good about it?
Well, it was just one event after another, and it was happening on the track and in the field. I think that was the night Tatiana Grigorieva nearly won the women's pole vault, and no one had ever heard of her other than the track and field buffs. But here was this absolutely magnificent looking young female athlete, and she was jumping the lights out in the pole vault. Didn't quite get there because the Americans had the world record holder, but Tatiana came second. There was a men's 10,000 metre race, which was just the most exciting 10,000 race I've ever seen. That 10,000 metres is, 6.25 miles, I think. And Haile Gebrselassie was the multi-Olympic and world champion from Ethiopia, and Paul Tergat of Kenya was also a mighty world-class distance runner, and they had a rivalry, but Gebrselassie always tended to win. And in that race, they were just absolutely neck and neck down the straight after, 9,900 metres. And as they hit the line, I have this sort of memory of feeling as though I could hear in the effects mic, and it was something I'd never heard before broadcasting any race, let alone a distance race, but it was like one of them in their extreme effort to get to the line first, like let out this mighty sort of grunt. And it's something I remember well. And that was a glorious Olympic event. I think the women's 5,000 was on that night, and that was a thrilling event as well. So it was just... And then Michael Johnson came out for the men's 400, and he was almost the star attraction of those games because he'd been so dominant and set world records in both the 2 and the 4 in Atlanta 4 years earlier. So of all the superstars, he was about the biggest, and it was like the race after the Melbourne Cup. No one really cared, and the night had just been so good.
What happened when Kathy crossed the line? Can you remember?
She would say relief, and Raylene Boyle, of course, produced that glorious line when Bruce was saying, what a moment, what a something or other, what a champion. And Raylene, very deadpan, said, what a relief. And it was for everyone, and certainly, we were feeling that in the commentary area, and it was just like a national celebration. The whole reconciliation discussion had been going on for some time in Australia, and this felt like a culmination. Sadly, you look back on it 24 years later and think, well, really, it was a step along the way, and it was a glorious moment. But it almost feels as though the nation, in terms of its sense of togetherness, with some sort of clarity on the objective, has lost its way, and I find that really, really sad that now there seems to be so much, cynicism from a certain side of Australian life towards the fact, and the Australia Day debate is a perfect example of this, that I just think it's so clear that Indigenous Australians do feel a sense of sadness on the 26th, even if it's not a personal thing. The fact is, it's not a day that could possibly unify them with the rest of Australia.
Sure.
And so expecting them to feel unified and resenting them for not having that as their preferred option just seems to me to be so totally unreasonable. And I felt that back when Kathy won that Olympic gold medal, the nation was in a far more reasoned kind of state.
Do you still listen to yourself?
A little bit when an old match comes up on Fox Footy, but I've been doing radio on AW for a number of years, and I don't have access to record. I suppose I do. I could probably just find them online. I've never tried to do that.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, that's what I meant. Have you ever listened? I'm sure, of course, you've listened back to the call of Kathy, but like listen back and go, wow, like that was me.
Well, yeah, and that's every now and then, as I've said, that moment gets pulled out, and at times I'm interviewed alongside it. And funnily enough, having heard it so many times, I listen now for the imperfections, and maybe that's the lot of people doing this kind of work. Probably true of artists, real artists. I'm not a real artist, but if you're made to examine your own work over and over again, you'll see the things that you could have done better.
It's always the case. That's why I do this thing, because you get better every week.
Yeah.
You get better every week.
Yeah.
I can't help but ask a question, and we'll close it up soon because you're going for a nice little pub pub feed after this. But
might have a steak.
I think it'd be rude not to. I might give you one to take home as well. Legacy. I saw a question the other day. I heard someone ask about, do you think legacy is about material contributions or intangible ones? What's your view on that?
You're talking about
legagy. Yeah.
What a broadcaster might leave behind after an extended time at the wheel.
Correct, yeah.
What were they again? Material
contributions such as wealth or achievements, or intangible ones like values and relationships.
Yeah. I think, like so much of life, balance is important. I mean, I'm not sure how I'd feel if I'd worked all my life and found ways of wasting all my money or had donated it and had nothing and was living in squalor sort of thing. That's not the case. I'm not wealthy. I'm probably on the right side of the national average, but and I'm grateful for that. I suppose as an outcome of it all, I mean, who knows who gets remembered? There are great Alan McGilvray, who was the king of cricket broadcasting on the ABC. I often said captured the sound of his sport better than anyone I ever heard. He had a beautiful voice, a beautiful mellow way of somehow creating a sound, of mixing his own voice with the crowd in a gentle sort of way that captured cricket. His last broadcasts were on the 1985 Australian Tour of England, and the memory of McGilvray is fading away. Media change, I guess. He was radio, and the eras had rolled over, and TV now with Channel 9 running the cricket and doing it brilliantly. Radio was relegated in a way to a lower position than it had occupied in all of McGilvray's years. So who of us gets remembered for all that long? I suppose I'd like to think that I did one or two things well enough for Kathy's call, the perfect example, I guess, that will continue to get replayed, and hopefully one day someone will say, gee, who was that bloke who called that? And that'd be nice. And, maybe for one's standards in whatever way that cause one to be remembered for some good reasons.
Is it? You talked before, like looking back, it's been so long. Like at the same time, does it feel quick?
Well, yeah, I've been reflecting recently, and this might be about my last good story because I'm just about out of them. You've emptied the bucket. But in my second year in Launceston with the ABC, so the first year I'm with 7AD Devonport. The second year I get work with the ABC part-time Launceston, and I'm still there for half of 1974. But I'm now doing extra work because they were trying to keep me interested. I was only, I wasn't earning a lot of money, but it was enough to pay my rent and have a few beers at the pub and all of that sort of thing. But they gave me ABC management from Hobart some opportunities just to earn a little bit more. I read the regional news once or twice a week at 7 minutes to 7 of an evening. And I also became the acting talks officer, which meant working from Launceston, I covered some regional stories, some of which were about the arts and things that I had no real great knowledge of and passion for. There was a bloke, Kenneth Gillespie, who was he was the doyen of ballet in Launceston, and I remember going to his place 2 or 3 times and interviewing him. Occasionally, famous people came to town. I went up to Channel 9 one day and interviewed Slim Dusty, which I thought was pretty good, and he asked me if I could give him a lift into town, which I did.
Roy's son, was it Roy? One of the famous American musicians as
Roy
well?
Orbison.
Yeah, there we go.
Was coming to town to do a concert.
Yeah.
Roy, you don't know Roy Orbison?
Yeah, of course I know him, yeah.
You know him,
just
just having a bit of a game with me.
Yeah.
And such were the times, having teed up the interview, I was given a time, a day, and the motel room number. I went to his motel room, knocked on the door. He opened the door, was expecting me. And I always colour this by saying that he had on a midnight blue satin dressing gown, and he did. And, of course, the dark glasses and everything else, and sat down with him. He couldn't have been more gracious or generous, and I did a 20-minute interview with him, and I was listening to a bit of his music the other day, and I was just thinking, how lucky was I to have that moment? I mean, he died in his early 50s.
1985 I saw.
89, I think it was.
Okay.
Yeah. And he's, never to be forgotten. He's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I actually had this chance to spend 20 minutes with him. I lost the tape. I don't know whether I'd want to hear it back because it would sound so abysmal. And I was thinking of the questions I should have asked him. He sang sad songs and he had enormous sadness in his life. That's not why he sang the sad songs. He was already doing those. But I think his 2 children from his first marriage were killed in a house fire. They were staying with his parents. And then his first wife was killed. They were motorbike fans, and she died in a riding accident. So he had these major misfortunes in his life. And so because of that, I just didn't think I could ask him about it. But I'm sure he would have responded, and it would have been so interesting to hear him talk about it. But I didn't have the maturity, I didn't have the wherewithal at that time. But what I did have was 20 minutes with Roy Orbison.
I feel like that moment with you today, honestly.
That's
I mean that. Like so many stories, and it's a real privilege to sit down with you. And like I said, I've heard you millions of times growing up as a young boy. So to sit down with you today has been absolutely amazing.
Thanks, Darcy. You've done a terrific job.
Thank you very much.
Of opening the lid on lots of those stories. Thank you.
I've got one little quote here to end it. You spend so many years doing it that perhaps when it's over, you can enjoy other aspects of your life more. That's a quote from you as well.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, it sucks a lot of the oxygen out of you. Media work does do that. And those who are in a brighter limelight than I am would know that better than I do. It can consume you and the life you live. I'm glad in a way that I've been in a more subdued limelight. I've been lucky to have the bit that I've had, to be able to enjoy that, because that provides the edge that makes the job so interesting and titillating. I'll take that. I'm happy with what I've had.
It's a good way to end it. Thank you so much for your time, Tim. Really
Thanks,
appreciate
Darcy.
that.